Will. I see you found your way to the Sci-Fi Academia YouTube channel. Now, before I start talking about why I think science fiction is important and good, I have to talk about why I think stories are so good. Now, I think there's sort of this misconception about stories, that is, stories aren't true, right? Fiction is exactly that, it's not real. But I think that sort of paints a very sort of overly narrow view of what reality is. Now, you might be rolling your eyes at me right now if you don't believe in symbols or believe that symbols might be inherent. But just please bear with me while I, sort of discuss this, because, I might win you over. I think a good story tells true stories through fiction, right? Just because something isn't historical, it isn't something that actually happened, doesn't mean that something can't communicate truth. That's a very basic understanding. I think we can all agree with that. When we get in the world of science fiction, I guess I should say when we get in the world of fantasy, but that is using fantasy in a more broad term than we maybe usually do. I'm not talking Middle Earth fantasy, though Middle Earth would definitely be included in it. But I'm using fantasy here just as, fiction, or the particular sort of fiction that science fiction and fantasy both fall into. Because I personally feel science fiction and fantasy are both sort of two sides of the same coin. They're basically the same genre. In one, we call it magic, and the other we call it science, right? Capiche? That's the only difference, really. But when we sort of step into that world, I think we almost enter into a sort of mythological world, if you will. Now, hopefully this is making sense so far. This is completely unscripted, so you never know what I'm going to say in one of these unscripted videos. When you enter into that sort of world, it's sort of like a mythological world, right? The superhero genre is just modern mythology, right? That's all it is. And I don't think it's hard to make that case. I don't think it's hard at all. What is mythology? I think, for one thing, it's sort of, it paints a magical view of the world. You might look at that, and you might say, well, there's no magic in the world. And, first off, being a religious person, I have to disagree. I think that there is a spiritual world. But even if you don't believe in any sort of religion, then I think you can still look at the world and realize the magic of the world, right? You can, and that doesn't necessarily mean something that's like breaking the laws of reality, but I think our brains don't get enough credit, right? Because brains are like the most advanced system we know. Perhaps that's why I like to keep a brain behind me, and I have another brain right over there. Maybe subconsciously I'm obsessed with brains. I don't know. But I think sometimes our brains pick up on things, and, there's just times when you just see something and that it carries this gravitas, right? Whether that's a beautiful mountain you climb up, and then you look over at this beautiful landscape and you see a beautiful sunset, right? and you're like, whoa, there's something to it. It feels magical. Maybe it's when you're having a conversation with someone and like there's just like sort of intimate connection or whatever it is. I think we all have these things that you wouldn't think of as magic, and fair enough, right? Like, these are just sort of natural things that kind of happen in the world, but I think there's so much gravitas within these sort of just things that we interact with every day, and I think sometimes we fail to acknowledge that, and that can be a problem. But I think you can kind of open your eyes to just sort of the beauty of the world around us and the environment and the people and how we can sort of connect with people and change each other and both become better out of interactions and stuff like that. I think what mythology does, right, it sort of transfers the sort of gravitas into a more exaggerated, right? It takes things that we know are powerful, right? But maybe on some level we don't realize how powerful they are. Our brain takes that, I think, through stories and symbolism, right? It spits out, what if Middle Earth, right? What if Doctor Who, which is, a popular one for me. There's just these concepts that I think just because Middle Earth or Doctor Who isn't factual.
Made up. Pure fiction. It's fiction.
It's not actually real. Doesn't mean that there's not truth within it. All that being said, I think why science fiction is so important is because it gives us an opportunity to communicate truth. Star Trek Next Generation, one of my all-time favorite shows. The entire premise of that show, when you kind of look into it and break its elements down, is humanity is on trial, right? That's the plot of episode 1, but it goes a little bit deeper than that. So, if you do not know, episode 1 of Star Trek Next Generation, you have Q, who decides that humans are probably too evil to be out in space doing some space stuff. So he puts them on trial, and the crew of the Enterprise has to prove that humanity is not, is better, right? That humanity is better than everything in the past that they did. That was bad and terrible and wrong. But then what's really interesting is the show ends with sort of revisiting that plot. And through various, time shenanigans and stuff, we literally see parts of that episode in the last episode. So the series comes full circle, which is really cool. In it, Q says the trial never ended. And I think part of what that communicates is, I think that's sort of what the premise of the show is. The premise is when humans are, out in space and they're coming up against these different circumstances, will they prove themselves to be good, or will they prove themselves to be bad, right? And, first off, that's just a really cool premise for a TV show. I think this is exactly the sort of things that science fiction has the ability to sort of talk to us about, right? It's sort of, I think every science fiction, all of the good science fiction, has a sprinkle of philosophy, right? Which, in part, I think is George Lucas's fault. Because George Lucas was very intentional about incorporating a sort of philosophy and like ideology into Star Wars, which was, obviously very successful. And I think Star Trek also did that a little bit, but I think more so in Next Generation than the original series. So, what am I saying here? I think what I'm saying, because I am somewhat trying to work this out as I speak, but I think the reason science fiction is important is because it allows us to take real world sort of things, and then it allows us to ponder them in maybe a more digestible sort of thing. But not just more digestible, more interesting, more subtle. Like I said, I think there is sort of like inherent symbolism just in the world around us. And I think a lot of symbolism is, of course, made up by culture, right? But I think there is also symbolism that goes deeper than that, that is inherent. All that being said, I think the day that we stop telling sci-fi stories, I think will also be the day that we stop dreaming. Because I think at the end of the day, every story, especially in the realm of fantasy, in the realm of fiction, it is a dream, right? Now, I don't think we know exactly how dreams work. We don't quite understand them. There is sort of a theory of it has something to do with memory. It has something to do with your short-term memory being, downloaded into your long-term memory data bank when you decide to go to sleep. Again, I think our brains are a lot smarter than we know. And I think our brains are able to sort of transfer ideas and memories and thoughts and, all the things that we come across and that makes us us in a lot of ways. I think our brains takes that and it re-sculpts it into something different. And I think that's why you will write a book, if anyone out there is a writer or, to any degree of a writer. If you've ever tried to write a story, I think you'll probably have the experience where you're writing something and it's not till after you finish writing it where you realize how directly that thing you wrote applies to your life and like very personal elements of who you are. So, it's like all fiction is important, I think, for that reason.